There was a girl in room 204 who never spoke. She sat in the last row, right next to the window, and spent most of her time looking outside at the trees swaying in the wind. Her name was, and she was 17 years old. She had transferred to Westbrook High School about 4 months ago, somewhere in the middle of the fall semester, and in all that time, nobody had heard her say more than a few words. The class was music appreciation, taught by a woman named Mrs. It was supposed to be an easy class. Most students signed up for it because they thought it would be a simple way to earn credits. They would listen to some classical music, write a short essay or two, and that would be it. But Mrs. took her subject very seriously. She believed that music was the language of the soul, and she expected her students to engage with it fully. Did not engage, at least not in any way that Mrs. could see. Every day the girl would walk into class quietly, take her seat in the back, and open her notebook. She would write things down when Mrs. spoke. She would listen when music played through the old speakers, but she never raised her hand. She never answered questions. She never smiled or laughed or showed any kind of reaction, even when other students made jokes or got into silly arguments about whether was better than. At first, Mrs. tried to be patient. She told herself that the girl was probably just shy. Some students took time to open up, especially if they were new. But as the weeks went by and continued to sit in silence, something began to shift in the way Mrs. looked at her. She started to feel annoyed. It was not a feeling she was proud of. Mrs. had been teaching for almost 20 years, and she liked to think of herself as a fair and understanding teacher. But there was something about silence that got under her skin. The way she sat so still, the way she never made eye contact, the way she seemed to exist in her own little world, completely separate from everyone else in the room. Mrs. began to interpret that silence as something else entirely. She convinced herself that was not shy at all. She decided that the girl was arrogant, that she thought she was too good for the class, too good for her classmates, too good to participate like everyone else. It was not true, of course, but Mrs. did not know that. What Mrs. did not know was that life had fallen apart exactly 1 year and 3 months ago. Before that had been a different person. She had lived in a small apartment in the city with her mother and father. Her father was a piano teacher. He gave lessons to children in the neighborhood, and sometimes he played at weddings and small concerts. He was not famous. He did not make a lot of money, but he loved music more than anything in the world, and he had passed that love on to his daughter. Had started playing piano when she was 4 years old. Her father would sit her on his lap and guide her tiny fingers across the keys. He would hum melodies and make up silly songs just to make her laugh. As she grew older, the lessons became more serious. He taught her scales and chords and proper technique. He introduced her to and Chopin, and he told her that music was not just about hitting the right notes. It was about feeling something and making other people feel it too. By the time she was 12, was playing pieces that most adults could not master. By the time she was 15, she was winning local competitions. Her father cried every time he watched her perform. He said she had a gift. He said she was going to do great things. Then he got sick. It started with a cough that would not go away. Then came the tiredness, the weight loss, the trips to the doctor that turned into trips to the hospital. The diagnosis was cancer, and it was already too far along to stop. Watched her father fade over the course of 6 months. She watched his strong hands become thin and weak. She watched the light leave his eyes, little by little, until there was almost nothing left. She played piano for him every single day, right up until the end. She played his favorite pieces, the ones he used to play for her when she was small. She played until her fingers ached and her heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. He passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, was holding his hand when it happened. After that, everything changed. His mother could not afford to stay in the city anymore. The medical bills had taken everything they had, so they packed up their small apartment, sold what they could, and moved to a cheaper town 2 hours away. That was how ended up at Westbrook High School, starting over in a place where nobody knew her name. She stopped playing piano after her father died. She could not bring herself to touch the keys. Every time she tried, she would hear his voice in her head, feel his presence beside her, and the grief would hit her so hard she could barely breathe. So she closed the lid of the old keyboard they had brought with them, and she did not open it again. She also stopped talking. Not completely, but almost. She would answer her mother when spoken to. She would say the bare minimum at school when she absolutely had to. But the girl who used to laugh and sing and fill rooms with music had disappeared. In her place was someone quiet and hollow, just trying to get through each day without falling apart. That was who sat in the back of Mrs. Music Appreciation class. Not an arrogant girl who thought she was better than everyone else. Just a broken girl who had lost everything and did not know how to find her way back. But Mrs. did not see any of that. She saw a student who refused to participate. She saw a challenge to her authority, and slowly, without even realizing it, she began to plan a way to teach that girl a lesson. It started as a small thought in the back of her mind. What if she called on in front of the whole class? What if she put her on the spot and forced her to speak? Surely that would shake her out of her shell. Surely that would prove that she was not so special after all. The thought grew bigger over time. Mrs. found herself looking at more often, studying her, waiting for the perfect moment. She told herself she was doing it for the girl's own good. She told herself that sometimes students needed a push. But deep down, in a place she did not like to look at, she knew the truth. She wanted to see embarrassed. She wanted to knock her down a peg. She wanted to prove that she was still in control of her classroom. And so she waited, she watched, and she planned. Meanwhile, had no idea what was coming. She sat by the window, looking at the trees, thinking about her father, and counting down the minutes until she could go home. She had no idea that her teacher had already decided to target her. She had no idea that everything was about to change. The storm was coming, and neither of them was ready for what would happen when it finally arrived. It was a Thursday afternoon in late November when Mrs. finally decided to make her move. The sky outside was gray and heavy with clouds, and the heating system in the old building was making that rattling noise it always made when winter was coming. Most of the students in room 204 were tired and distracted, counting down the minutes until the final bell would ring and set them free. Mrs. stood at the front of the classroom with a strange kind of energy about her. She had been planning this moment for weeks, turning it over in her mind, imagining how it would play out. She had convinced herself that what she was about to do was the right thing. She told herself it was about education, about pushing students out of their comfort zones, about teaching them that participation was not optional. But the truth was simpler and uglier than that. She wanted to make a point. She wanted to show the quiet girl in the back row that she could not hide forever. The old grand piano sat in the corner of the room, covered in a thin layer of dust. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Sometimes Mrs. would play a few notes on it to demonstrate a concept, but mostly it just sat there, forgotten and ignored. The keys were slightly yellow with age, and one of the legs had a small crack that nobody had ever bothered to fix. Mrs. cleared her throat and clapped her hands together to get everyone's attention. "All right, class," she said, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that felt slightly forced. "I have a special activity planned for today, something a little different from our usual lessons." A few students perked up at this. Anything different was welcome when you were stuck in a classroom on a gray Thursday afternoon. Others just slouched lower in their seats, hoping they would not be called on for whatever this activity turned out to be. "As you all know," Mrs. continued, "we have been studying the great composers and their works. We have listened to recordings. We have analyzed techniques. We have discussed the emotions behind the music. But there is one thing we have not done yet." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence stretch out. "We have not performed." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the room. A boy in the second row raised his hand and asked if this meant they were all going to have to sing or something. Mrs. shook her head with a small smile. No, no, nothing like that. I am not going to force everyone to perform. That would not be fair to those who have no musical training, but I thought it might be valuable for us to have a little demonstration, to see what it feels like to watch a live performance up close, rather than just listening to recordings. She gestured toward the old piano in the corner. I would like to invite one of you to come up and play something for us. It does not have to be perfect. It does not have to be long. Just a few minutes of music, shared with your classmates. A chance to experience the vulnerability and beauty of live performance. The classroom went quiet. Students exchanged glances, silently praying they would not be chosen. A girl near the front sank down in her chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. Nobody wanted to be the one to walk up to that dusty piano and embarrass themselves in front of everyone. Mrs. let the uncomfortable silence hang in the air for a moment. Then, slowly and deliberately, she turned her gaze toward the back of the room. The girl was sitting in her usual spot by the window, her notebook open in front of her, her eyes fixed on something outside. She had not been paying attention to what Mrs. was saying. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with music class. Mrs. said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "Why don't you come up and play something for us?" Every head in the classroom turned toward the back row, blinked, startled out of her thoughts, and looked up to find everyone staring at her. For a moment, she did not understand what was happening. Then the words registered and her stomach dropped. What?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The piano," Mrs. repeated, pointing toward the corner. "Come up and play something for the class. Since you never participate in our discussions, I thought this might be a nice way for you to contribute." There was something in the teacher's tone that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. It did not sound like a friendly invitation. It sounded like a challenge, like a trap. His face went pale. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Play the piano, in front of everyone. She had not touched a piano in over a year. She had not played a single note since her father died. The thought of walking up to that instrument and pressing down on those keys made her feel like she might be sick. I don't," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Come now," Mrs. said, her smile widening. "Don't be shy. I am sure you can play something. Even just a simple melody would be fine. This is a safe space. No one is going to judge you." But that was exactly what was happening, and everyone in the room knew it. The other students could feel the tension in the air. They could see the way Mrs. was looking at, like a cat watching a mouse. Some of them felt bad for the quiet girl. Others were just relieved that they had not been chosen instead. A boy near the middle of the room whispered something to his friend, and they both snickered. The sound cut through like glass. She could feel her cheeks burning with shame. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. "Mrs.," she tried again, her voice so quiet it was almost impossible to hear. "I really don't think I can." "Nonsense," the teacher interrupted. "Everyone can do something. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. The fear of performing, the vulnerability. You need to face it head on. Now come up here and show us what you can do." It was not a request anymore. It was an order. Sat frozen in her seat for what felt like an eternity. The whole class was watching her, waiting. Some with curiosity, some with pity, some with the cruel anticipation of watching someone fail. Mrs. stood at the front of the room with her arms crossed, that thin smile still on her face, absolutely certain that she had won. She expected the girl to crumble. She expected her to admit that she could not play. She expected tears, maybe, or a stammered apology. She expected to finally be humbled, to finally understand that she could not sit in silence forever without consequences. What she did not expect was what happened next. Closed her notebook, she took a deep breath, and then slowly she stood up from her desk. The room went completely silent as she walked toward the front of the classroom. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. Her hands were trembling at her sides. Every step felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff. She reached the piano and stood there for a moment, looking down at the dusty keys. So many memories came flooding back. Her father's hands guiding hers, the sound of his laughter when she made a mistake, the way he would close his eyes and sway gently when she played something beautiful. She had not let herself think about these things in so long. She had locked them away in a box deep inside her heart because the pain was too much to bear. But now, standing in front of this old piano with the whole class watching, she could feel that box beginning to crack open. Mrs. watched from behind her desk, still smiling, still certain of her victory. Any second now, the girl would admit defeat. Any second now, she would prove that she was nothing special after all. Sat down on the bench. She placed her fingers on the keys, and for a moment everything was still. Then she began to play. The first note rang out into the silence of the classroom, and it was like a crack of thunder on a still night. His fingers had found the keys almost on their own, guided by a memory that lived somewhere deeper than thought. She had not planned to play anything specific. She had not planned to play at all. But the moment her hands touched the cold ivory, something inside her broke open, and the music came pouring out like water through a dam. She began with a soft, slow melody. The notes floated through the air like leaves falling from a tree. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if the music itself was testing the waters. A few students shifted in their seats, unsure of what they were hearing. Mrs. leaned forward slightly, her smile starting to falter. Then the music changed. His fingers began to move faster. The melody grew more complex, more layered, building on itself like waves rolling toward the shore. Her right hand danced across the high keys while her left hand anchored the rhythm below, and the two came together in a way that made the old piano sing like it had never sung before. She was playing Chopin, Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano, a 10-minute journey through every human emotion imaginable. Joy and sorrow, hope and despair, love and loss. It was the kind of piece that professional pianists spent years trying to master, the kind of piece that separated the good from the truly great. And was playing it from memory, without a single sheet of music in front of her, as if it was as natural as breathing. The classroom had gone completely still. Nobody moved, nobody whispered, nobody even seemed to breathe. The students who had been ready to laugh were now staring with their mouths hanging open. The ones who had felt sorry for were frozen in shock. Even the boy who had snickered earlier was sitting up straight, his eyes wide, unable to look away. Mrs. stood behind her desk like a statue. The smile had vanished from her face entirely. In its place was something else. Confusion at first, then disbelief, and then something that looked almost like fear. This was not what she had expected. This was not what she had planned. She had wanted to expose the quiet girl, to prove that she was nothing special. Instead, she was witnessing something extraordinary. Played on, lost in the music, her eyes closed and her body swaying gently with each phrase. She was not in the classroom anymore. She was somewhere else entirely. She was back in the small apartment in the city, sitting next to her father on the old piano bench. She could almost feel his warmth beside her. She could almost hear his voice in her ear, guiding her through the difficult passages, telling her to feel the music, not just play it. This had been his favorite piece. He used to play it for her when she was small, before she was old enough to understand how complex it was. She would sit on the floor and listen, watching his hands move across the keys like magic, and she would think that her father must be the greatest pianist in the whole world. Later, when she was older and more skilled, he had taught it to her. It took months of practice. There were times when she wanted to give up, when the technical demands seemed impossible, when her fingers cramped and her mind went blank. But he never let her quit. He sat beside her, patient and encouraging, and told her that the struggle was part of the beauty, that the piece was not just about the notes. It was about the journey. She had played it at his funeral. It was the last thing she ever played for him. And now, more than a year later, she was playing it again. In a dusty classroom, in a town where nobody knew her, in front of a teacher who had tried to humiliate her. She was playing it and she was crying. The tears came without warning, sliding down her cheeks as her fingers continued to move. She did not try to stop them. She did not even open her eyes. The music had taken over completely, carrying her through the grief she had been running from for so long. Every note was a memory. Every chord was a goodbye. Every crescendo was a scream of pain that she had never allowed herself to release. The students watched in stunned silence. Some of them had tears in their own eyes now, even though they did not fully understand why. There was something about the music that reached inside them and grabbed hold of something deep. It was raw and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. It was the kind of performance that made you forget where you were, that made time itself seem to stop. Mrs. had sunk down into her chair. Her hands were gripping the edge of her desk so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She could not take her eyes off the girl at the piano, the girl she had dismissed, the girl she had judged, the girl she had tried to destroy. What had she done? The question echoed in her mind as the music swelled toward its climax. She had been so certain, so convinced that she was right. She had looked at silence and seen arrogance when all along it had been something else entirely. Pain, grief, a wound so deep that it could not be spoken, only felt. And she had ripped it open in front of everyone. The final section of the piece arrived, and its playing became something almost superhuman. Her fingers flew across the keys in cascades of notes that seemed impossible for two hands to produce. The old piano groaned and sang under the force of her playing, filling the room with a sound so big it seemed to press against the walls. The music was everywhere. It was everything. And then suddenly it was over. The last chord rang out and slowly faded into silence. Hands came to rest on the keys, and she sat there for a moment, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The tears were still falling, dripping onto the dusty wood of the piano, leaving small dark spots on its surface. Nobody moved. The silence lasted for what felt like forever. The students sat frozen, unsure of what to do, unsure of what they had just witnessed. It was not like anything they had ever experienced before. It was not like a performance at all. It was like watching someone's soul being turned inside out. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, someone started to clap. It was a single pair of hands at first, slow and uncertain. Then another joined in, and another, and suddenly the whole classroom was applauding, the sound building and building until it was almost as loud as the music had been. Students were rising to their feet, one by one, giving a standing ovation to the quiet girl they had never bothered to notice before. Finally opened her eyes. She looked up, blinking through her tears, and saw her classmates standing and clapping. She saw their faces, full of amazement and respect and something that looked like awe. She saw people who had ignored her for months now looking at her like she was someone worth seeing. And at the front of the room she saw Mrs. The teacher had not stood up. She had not applauded. She was still sitting at her desk, her face pale and her eyes filled with something that had never expected to see there. Shame. The applause continued, but everything had gone quiet again. She looked at her teacher, and her teacher looked back at her, and in that moment they both understood that something had changed forever. The plan to embarrass her had failed. The attempt to break her had only revealed how strong she truly was. Wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She took a shaky breath, and for the first time in over a year she felt something other than grief. She felt free. The applause faded slowly, like the last notes of a song drifting away into nothing. Students began to lower their hands and sink back into their seats, but nobody took their eyes off. She was still sitting at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, her face wet with tears that she had stopped trying to hide. For a long moment, nobody knew what to say. The classroom felt different now, like something invisible had shifted in the air. The girl they had all ignored for months had just done something none of them could have imagined. She had taken an old dusty piano and made it sound like it belonged in a concert hall. She had played with a skill that most of them did not even know existed outside of videos on the internet. And she had cried the entire time. A girl sitting in the front row was the first to move. Her name was Lucy, and she had been in this school her whole life. She was the kind of person who talked to everyone, who always seemed to know what was going on, who never let an awkward silence last too long. She stood up from her desk and walked slowly toward the piano, her footsteps loud in the quiet room. Looked up as Lucy approached. She expected judgment. She expected questions. She expected the kind of awkward pity that people give when they do not know what else to offer. But instead, Lucy just stood there for a moment, looking at her with something soft in her eyes. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," Lucy said quietly. "I don't even know what to say." Did not respond. She did not trust her voice yet. Her throat was tight with all the emotion she had just poured into the music, and she was afraid that if she tried to speak, she would start crying all over again. Other students began to gather around. They came slowly at first, hesitant and unsure, but soon there was a small crowd forming near the piano. Everyone wanted to be closer. Everyone wanted to understand what they had just witnessed. "Where did you learn to play like that?" a boy asked. He was tall and skinny with glasses that kept sliding down his nose. Remembered seeing him in class before, always scribbling notes, always paying attention. "That piece you played, I've heard it before. My mom listens to classical music sometimes. That's like professional level stuff." Swallowed hard. She looked down at the piano keys, yellow and worn from years of use. How could she explain? How could she put into words something that went so deep? "My father taught me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The students leaned in closer, straining to hear. "Your father," Lucy repeated. "Is he a music teacher or something?" Shook her head slowly. The memories were rising up again, threatening to overwhelm her. But this time she did not push them away. She let them come. "He was a pianist," she said. "Back in China before we moved here. He played at concerts and weddings. He gave lessons to children in our neighborhood. He loved music more than anything." She paused, her voice catching. "He started teaching me when I was 4 years old." The students exchanged glances. They were beginning to understand that this was not just a story about piano lessons. There was something deeper here, something painful. "He sounds amazing," Lucy said gently. "Does he still play?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, fresh tears were spilling down her cheeks. "He passed away," she said. "A little over a year ago, cancer." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The students stood frozen, their faces shifting from curiosity to shock to something that looked like heartbreak. They had not expected this. They had not expected any of this. Lucy reached out and put a hand on shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It was the first time anyone at this school had touched her with kindness. "I'm so sorry," Lucy whispered. "I had no idea." "Nobody did," said quietly. "I never told anyone. After he died, I couldn't play anymore. Every time I sat down at the piano, all I could think about was him. It hurt too much, so I stopped." She looked up at the faces surrounding her. These people who had been strangers just an hour ago. These people who had never bothered to look past her silence and see the person underneath. "That piece I just played," she continued, "it was his favorite. He taught it to me over months and months of practice. He was so patient with me, even when I wanted to give up. He said the struggle was part of the beauty." Her voice broke on the last word. "I played it at his funeral. It was the last time I ever played, until today." The boy with the glasses took off his spectacles and wiped his eyes. Several other students were crying openly now. Even the ones in the back of the room, the ones who had stayed in their seats, were sitting in stunned silence. Through her tears, became aware of someone standing apart from the group. She looked up and saw Mrs. at the front of the classroom. The teacher had not moved from her desk. She had not joined the crowd of students. She was just standing there, pale and still, watching everything unfold with an expression that could not quite read. Their eyes met across the room. In that moment, understood something. Mrs. had not called on her to give her a chance to shine. She had called on her to watch her fail. The whole exercise, the whole speech about vulnerability and performance, it had all been a setup. The teacher had wanted to humiliate her. And somehow, impossibly, it had turned into something else entirely. Mrs. looked away first. She turned toward the window, her shoulders stiff, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She did not say a word. She did not try to take control of the class or move on to the next lesson. She just stood there, silent and small, like a person who had just realized they had made a terrible mistake. The bell rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the emotional weight of the room. Students jumped at the sound, startled back into the real world. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to gather their things and drift toward the door. But nobody was in a hurry. Nobody wanted to leave. Lucy was the last to go. She squeezed shoulder one more time and smiled at her. "I know we've never really talked before," she said, "but I'd like to change that if you want." Looked at her, this girl who had been a stranger just an hour ago, and felt something warm bloom in her chest. It was small and fragile, but it was real. "I'd like that," she said. Lucy smiled and headed for the door, leaving alone at the piano with Mrs. still standing at the front of the room. The classroom emptied out, voices fatting down the hallway, until it was just the two of them in the silence. Stood up slowly from the piano bench. Her legs felt weak, like she had just run a marathon. She gathered her notebook and her bag, moving carefully, deliberately, taking her time. She did not look at Mrs. She did not know what she would say if their eyes met again. She was almost to the door when the teacher's voice stopped her. It was soft, uncertain, nothing like the confident, commanding voice that had called her up to the piano just an hour before. Paused with her hand on the doorframe, she did not turn around. Mrs. started, then stopped. There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." 2 words, that was all. But they hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then slowly she turned to look at her teacher. Mrs. Face was different now. The hardness was gone. The judgment was gone. In its place was something raw and human, regret, shame, and underneath it all the beginning of something that might have been understanding. Did not smile. She did not say it was okay, because it was not okay, not yet. What the teacher had tried to do was cruel, even if it had not worked out the way she planned. But she also did not walk away angry. She just looked at her teacher, this woman who had misjudged her so completely, and gave a small nod. Then she turned and walked out the door, leaving Mrs. alone in the empty classroom with nothing but the silence and the weight of her own choices. Outside, the gray sky had begun to clear. A few rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds, touching the world with warmth. Walked through the hallway, her bag over her shoulder, her heart still aching but somehow lighter than it had been in a very long time. She had played again, she had cried, she had let people see her. And for the first time since her father died, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. Word spread through the school like wildfire. By the next morning, it seemed like everyone had heard about what happened in room 204. Students who had never even been in Mrs. class were talking about it in the hallways. They whispered about the quiet girl who had sat in the back row for months without saying a word, and how she had suddenly revealed herself to be some kind of piano genius. Noticed the change immediately. People looked at her differently now. They smiled at her in the hallways. They said hello. A few even stopped her to ask questions about where she learned to play, how long she had been practicing, whether she was going to perform again. It was strange and overwhelming, but not entirely unpleasant. Lucy found her at lunch that first day and insisted she sit with her group of friends. Hesitated at first, unsure if she belonged, but Lucy would not take no for an answer. She pulled out a chair and patted the seat and sat down among people who actually wanted to talk to her. They asked about her life, her interests, her father. They listened when she spoke. They laughed at her small jokes and included her in their conversations like she had always been there. It was the first time, since moving to this town, that felt like she might actually belong somewhere. But the biggest change came a few days later, when the school's music director showed up at her classroom door. His name was Mr., and he was a short man with wild gray hair and glasses that were always slightly crooked. He ran the school orchestra and the choir, and he had a reputation for being passionate about music to the point of obsession. He had heard about its performance from at least a dozen different students, and he had to see for himself if the stories were true. He found her after class and introduced himself. He asked if she would be willing to play something for him, was nervous, but she agreed. They went to the music room, where there was a much nicer piano than the old one in room 204, and she played for him. Not the Chopin this time, but something else. A piece by that her father had loved, full of soft colors and gentle movement, like sunlight on water. When she finished, Mr. was silent for a long time. He took off his crooked glasses and cleaned them with his shirt, a habit he had when he was thinking hard about something. "Young lady," he said finally, "do you have any idea how talented you are?" Did not know how to answer that question. She had never thought about it in those terms. Playing piano was just something she did, something she had always done, something her father had given her. Mr. told her about a regional music competition that was happening in 2 months. It was a big deal, he said. Students from schools all over the state would be competing. Winners often went on to receive scholarships and opportunities that could change their lives. He wanted her to enter. Almost said no. The thought of performing in front of judges, in front of hundreds of strangers, made her stomach twist with fear. But then she thought about her father. She thought about what he would say if he were here. She thought about all those years of lessons and practice, all those hours spent at the piano, all his dreams for her future. She said yes. The next 2 months were intense. Practiced every day, sometimes for hours at a time. Mr. worked with her on technique and interpretation, pushing her to dig deeper into the music, to find new layers of meaning in pieces she thought she already knew. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done since her father died. But it was also healing. Every time she sat down at the piano, she felt a little more connected to who she used to be, a little more whole. Lucy and her new friends came to watch her practice sometimes. They would sit in the corner of the music room and do their homework while played, offering encouragement and applause whenever she finished a piece. It was silly and sweet, and it meant more to than she could ever express. The day of the competition arrived cold and bright, with frost on the ground and a sharp blue sky overhead. Mother drove her to the auditorium where the event was being held. It was a huge building, much bigger than anything had performed in before. Her mother held her hand in the parking lot and told her that no matter what happened, she was proud of her, that her father would be proud of her too. Walked into that auditorium with her heart pounding and her hands trembling. She watched the other performers go before her, each one talented and polished and confident. She felt small and scared and completely out of place. Then her name was called, and she walked onto the stage. The piano was a grand, black and gleaming under the bright lights. The audience was a sea of faces she could not make out. The judges sat in the front row with their notepads and their serious expressions. Everything felt too big, too bright, too much. But then she sat down. She placed her fingers on the keys, and she closed her eyes. She thought about her father. She thought about the small apartment where they used to live, and the sound of his laughter, and the way he would hum along when she played. She thought about all the love he had poured into teaching her, all the hours he had spent sitting beside her on the bench, all the dreams he had dreamed on her behalf. And then she played. She played the Chopin again. The same piece she had played in room 204, the same piece she had played at his funeral. But this time it was different. This time it was not just grief pouring out of her. It was gratitude. It was love. It was a promise to keep going, to keep playing, to keep honoring everything he had given her. When the last note faded into silence, the audience erupted. The applause was deafening. People rose to their feet, opened her eyes and saw hundreds of strangers standing and clapping for her, and she felt tears streaming down her face for the second time in 2 months. She won first place. The trophy was tall and golden, and it had her name engraved on a little plaque at the bottom. Mr. cried when they announced the results. Her mother cried too. Lucy and her friends screamed so loud that people turned to stare at them, but they did not care. That night, after the celebration had died down and was alone in her room, she sat by the window and looked up at the stars. She thought about everything that had happened since that gray Thursday afternoon when Mrs. had called her up to the piano. She thought about how scared she had been, how angry, how broken. And she thought about how, somehow, it had all led to this. A few weeks after the competition, Mrs. asked to speak with her after class. Agreed, though she was not sure what to expect. They had not really talked since that first quiet apology. The teacher looked different now, softer somehow, tired in a way that suggested she had been doing a lot of thinking. "I owe you more than a 2-word apology," Mrs. said. "What I did to you was wrong. I made assumptions about you without knowing anything about your life. I tried to hurt you because I was frustrated and prideful, and instead you showed me something beautiful." She paused, her voice catching. "I've been teaching for 20 years and I thought I knew everything. But you taught me something I should have learned a long time ago. Never judge someone by their silence. You never know what they're carrying inside." Listened quietly. Then she did something that surprised them both. She smiled. "If you hadn't called me up that day," said, "I might never have played again. I was so scared to touch the piano, so scared of the memories, but you forced me to face it. And even though it hurt, it also set me free." Mrs. eyes filled with tears. She started to apologize again but shook her head. "I'm not saying what you did was right," said gently, "but I'm saying that sometimes good things come from hard places. My father used to tell me that. I think I finally understand what he meant." They stood there for a moment, teacher and student, 2 people who had hurt each other and helped each other in ways neither of them had expected. Then Mrs. reached out and squeezed hand and squeezed back. By the time graduation came around, had been accepted to one of the best music conservatories in the country on a full scholarship. Her mother cried for 3 days straight when the letter arrived. Lucy threw her a party. Mr. told everyone who would listen that he had discovered her. But knew the truth. She had not been discovered by anyone. She had been there all along, sitting quietly in the back row, carrying a gift that her father had given her and a grief that had almost buried it forever. All it took was one moment of cruelty that turned into something else entirely. One teacher's plan that backfired in the most beautiful way. One girl who found her voice again, not through words, but through music. And somewhere she liked to think her father was watching, smiling, proud of the woman she was becoming. The quiet girl had finally been heard.